Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. Special thank you to those for whom this is a new and strange place to have visited. I'm glad you've chosen to come here. We're going to speak today about what, if any, counsel the Buddha Dharma brings to dealing with difficult situations in a turbulent world. Many of us can perhaps suppose that we're unique and that we live in interesting times. But actually, if we study history at all, we see that it's quite filled with churn and difficulty and distress, uncertainty, change of societies. And that all of these rising and falling empires, different systems of information, different systems of control, different economic systems, different governance structures, every one of these things kind of has its causes and conditions which give rise to it. Those causes and conditions sort of play out, cease to be, and that which propelled this particular system to engage then ceases, and the system changes, and then something else comes to the fore. Is there something we need to adjust?
Sorry, the heat kicked on, so we thought we better close the windows a little bit.
I can't handle all the churn. No. So it's a unique feature of human culture that we have the ability to receive intelligence from our ancestors. And if we do it wisely, we can learn the lessons that we haven't had to live through, and we can take society and move it forward. And by and large, I think this is very much occurring. I mean, the average lifespan, the average literacy level, nutrition rates, infant mortality, the poverty levels, and so on. If you look at this from the largest possible view, we're not doing that bad, really. And yet, there's always this churn, and there's this difficulty. And of course, when we were thinking about the year, we noticed this little minor event of the election. And we thought, that's probably going to be a lot of churn for a lot of folks. So we thought together that it would be nice to set some time aside to specifically talk about what the Buddha Dharma might have to say about political stuff and about dealing with the tumult and the churn. And I think the place to begin that occurs to me right now is in this formative writing in the Pali tradition called the Dhammapada. And the first verse goes something like, the Buddha said, all we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make our world. Think or act with an impure mind, and suffering will follow as inevitably as a cart follows the ox that draws it. And then again, he said, all that we are, all that we experience comes from our thoughts. With our thoughts, we create our world. Think or act with a pure mind, and happiness and joy will follow you, as inevitably as the cart follows the ox that draws it. And that sounds really nice, and that maybe sounds really sweet, and that sounds maybe kind of simplistic. There are lots of people that have maybe thought and acted with lovely motivations, and yet great suffering comes. How about that? But in order to really understand what's being pointed to in these teachings, we have to really ask the question of ourselves, what does it mean to speak or act with a pure mind? Like, what does that actually mean? And what is actually meant by suffering and happiness? It's easy for us to import notions that, like, well, if I just behave dutifully and I'm a good little boy, then all will be well for me. If I do all the good little things that a good little girl is supposed to do, everything's going to work out great. And how's that landing for everybody? There's a bit more to it than that. And conversely, we can get into a funny thing where, like, if some trouble comes, then it must be us who did it to ourselves, because after all, if we were thinking well and beautifully, then we would have no suffering in our life. And clearly, my life has suffering, so I must be a schmo. It's my fault. But all of those and other kind of mistaken versions, or I would say unhelpful ways of looking at the teaching, are based on not really understanding clearly what pure means, and not understanding very clearly what suffering means and what the lack of suffering means. And so we're going to spend some time unpacking this and looking at it together. And then hopefully having some conversation together and doing some questions and answers and stuff. Some people think that pure must mean the idea is that we should eschew society and we should go and get a cave somewhere in the Himalayas. I hear they're pretty cheap these days. And we can go live as an ascetic and just leave the world behind, and that's what you're supposed to do. But that's not what we see. That's certainly not what the Buddha did, and that's not what the Zen tradition holds up. And that's not been my training, nor that of my teachers. We are not really practitioners of asceticism here. And if anything, the practice of the Buddha Dharma should lead to a more enlightened society, a more civil and intelligent and compassionate way of being in the world. It's not about just leaving the world and letting it kind of fall apart on its own. So we don't want to use spiritual teachings or practices to sort of bypass or to not care about or to disengage from. Rather, if your spiritual practice, I would say, whatever it is, if it has any value, it has to show up in the world that desperately needs it. And that happens at the greatest levels, let us say nations, I suppose, and then cities and towns and places where we work, families. But the basis of it really is the individual. So what does it mean to think and act with a pure mind? What does it mean to think and act with an impure mind? And when we look at this question, there's a lot of very specific teaching on it that sounds so self-evident that it seems like, why even bother? And the answer is because we're silly and we need it. That's why we forget the most basic things, although it seems everyone has shown up with their pants on today, so that's good. But you never know. You never know. It's good to have friends who can help check things. So consider this as a proposition. Pure and impure here has nothing to do with aligning with the inscrutable will of a divine entity. Okay? In this tradition, it's not wound around there being some all-seeing entity out there that has a veiled or hidden or revealed agenda. And what pure means is whatever the deity says it is. So if the deity says, slay the Amalekites, leave none alive, that's pure because God told us to do it. So the definition of what's good is what comes from the deity. And it doesn't have to be Yahweh, it can be any, put your figure in there. But that doesn't really catch it, not in the Buddhist sense anyway. The Buddha is definitely not a deity, not a God figure who's monitoring your every thought, and if you do or do not align with what the Buddha said, you'll get judged accordingly and punished or rewarded. It's not like this. And it's very difficult for those of us who grow up in the Zoroastrian, Judeo-Christian, Islamic sort of basket of traditions to even notice that conditioning running. Many have done the work to see it, and that's fine. There are healthy ways to be in those traditions, obviously. There are great mystics and saints everywhere. I wish there were more. But the cognitive framework of pure in this teaching is not about aligning to what the Buddha said because you're supposed to. Rather, it's pretty specific. It means anything that you do that causes suffering for yourself or anyone else, we'll just go right on ahead and call that impure. Anything that we do that causes suffering or anguish for ourselves or anyone or anything is missing the mark. And by contrast, the simple corollary to that is anything that you think or say or do that alleviates suffering for yourself or for others, well, we'll go ahead and call that pure. That's what it means. So anything that I do, that I think, that I act, that I say, these are the ways that we generate karma, body, speech, and mind. Anything I do in those realms that causes myself harm, we'll go ahead and call that impure. Or another word you could use is evil. Or you could say unwholesome. Pick a word that seems right. But that's not acceptable. So if the Buddha would appear right here and command us all to go and slay members of the other political party, I would reject that entirely and tell that Buddha to get out of my space. Not acceptable. So in a way, we don't need a revelation of some truth that you don't have access to, that only the priests do, to be able to tell what's right and wrong. That's just a little bit silly from this tradition's perspective. You have inside yourself all the information you need to know. Are you hurting yourself right now? If so, let's stop that. Not because Buddha said or Rinzhen sees or anything like that, but because it hurts. And conversely, anything that we do that alleviates suffering, I don't need an external authority to come down and tell me that that's okay. You have all the authority you need in your own life just because you're here, you're existent, you know. If you do something that alleviates suffering and pain for yourself, it's a good thing. Now, pain is unavoidable. Change is one of the basic facts of reality. Things shift all the time. There is nothing that is permanent, the tradition says. And pain is a part of having a nervous system. If your nerves are functioning, you'll feel pleasure, you'll feel pain. That's not suffering, though. Suffering is when we are living out a fiction that does not correspond to the reality that we're actually engaged in. And the friction between the fantasy or the story and the truth, that's suffering. So a really good example is if I hallucinate myself to still be 25, I'm going to be really disappointed every time I look in the mirror. Like, who's that old wizened dude? This body isn't supposed to age. I'm supposed to be young and like a Greek god forever. And then you look in the mirror and it's like, oh, what happened? Now, if I have a fictional story that tells me aging is evil and horrible and some horrible tragedy is being, a travesty, in fact, is being done unto me, this is not fair, this white stuff here, this is not acceptable, how can it be? Well, it's, old man yelling at cloud, right? It's just, you're just being silly. What doesn't age? What, is there a tree out here that is not subject to a life cycle? Is there a cloud that doesn't have its beginning and then its dissipation? Gosh, even the earth itself, we know it's come, it's going to go. Why should we be any different? So when we can actually see the truth, even the simple one like this, aging is a thing. And if you're lucky enough to be alive, that means you're also lucky enough to be aging by the breath, that 1 and 1 is 2. And there's nothing wrong. It's not a punishment. It can certainly feel that way. But it's not. So the actual experience of aging, let's say, and all the various unmentionables that become part of daily life, the erosions of strengths that we once had, the loss of mobility and independence and whatever else, health. There's certainly some pain there. And no rational thinking person can just talk it away. It just hurts. But it's possible to not suffer while it's happening. If you can actually embrace the fact of aging, let us say, as a natural experience of life, you can play with it and you can even enjoy it. The arthritis is still difficult. The conditions still need tending to. But the mental strain around thinking something is horribly wrong here and this isn't fair and this is an attack of reality on me, we can just let that stuff not happen. Does it make sense? So I would say then that, if I think and act with a pure mind, that means that I'm thinking and acting in alignment with what is actually so. And when I think and act in alignment with what is actually so, then thinking and acting out of a fiction that does not align to it isn't going to happen. So what does it mean to think and act in alignment with what is actually so? Right? And here we get into a very funny part about being human. As far as we know, it's kind of unique. For some notable, maybe exceptions. But like a fish swims in water and a bird flies in the air, the human mind maneuvers in language. Me, you, up, down, this, that, right, left, yes, no. And for some reason, the Buddha brings our attention to language and says, here, dear one, is where the work needs to be done. Watch your mind. Watch how the mind itself operates. So rather than having an orientation towards here are the commands you must cohere to, like it or not, understand it or not, instead of this or some other model, we have guidance that says you must learn to pay very exquisite and meticulous attention to the experience that you're having moment to moment to moment. Because it's in that moment to moment experience and the noticing of it at deeper and deeper levels that this cage of language begins to loosen. The stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and what other people are and what things mean, they matter to us. And they're not evil inherently or anything. However, when we take our partial understanding of the world and hallucinate that it's actually the truth, and then other folks don't align with it, we're outraged. When we don't align with it, we're outraged. So how do we begin to work with the mind in this way. It's not about learning a bunch of Buddhist lingo and having cool Buddhist phrases to lob at people. It's not about just going stoic and silent and having no opinion about anything. You have to say something. You need to vote. Please vote. To stand aside and say, I just am not going to get engaged is not acceptable. So how do we do this? The Buddha said very clearly that life itself, the first thing that we begin to notice and pay attention to, is this sense of dis-ease, this sense of dissatisfaction, this feeling that we can never quite satisfactorily land in a permanent way on pleasure. If you notice the most pleasurable experiences that you've had, perhaps your top 10 list, if you have such a list, each of those experiences are not probably present to you like right now. The best meal you've ever had came out differently. You wouldn't want it back. The most exquisite music begins and ends. I'm into music, it's important to me, and yet sexual experience or relationality or any of these things. Even if we were able to sort of concoct and manifest our ideal indulgence, whatever that might be, you had a big heaping plate of it right in front of you, and you're thinking about it all week. Oh, there's going to be that great dinner. So the whole week is spent anticipating that dinner, and then you get there, and somehow the forkfuls don't quite land right, because before you know it, you're full. Oh, I couldn't have another bite. But you know, Mom made it. Oh, come on, honey. Okay, Mom. And the same thing is now a burden. Same food. But now it's... You think sitting in meditation is hard? Try eating breakfast all day long. That's really hard to do. Nonstop. Eat. You cannot. And so then what's really funny is we'll get to the point where the meal, even as we're having it, the mind starts to scan for what else, right? Like, well, okay, what else is going on here? You know, maybe that bit of the conversation at the table is a little irritating or a lot irritating. Maybe there's that behavior over there we're just gonna not notice. This is pleasing though, I'll focus on that. And basically your system is constantly scanning for problems and things to enjoy. Reasonable enough. I mean, even a cell will have limits about what can and cannot penetrate the membrane and enter the cell. It'll take in nutrients and excrete wastes. There's nothing wrong with it. But when we don't understand how it's working, we can actually misperceive the whole process. And so you go from the meal, and now the dessert, and then the nightcap, and on and on and on. And then even if it's great, it ends. And then you're left with a memory of that meal, let's say. And then it can be the case that the memory of that meal ends up being a wound, because now all the other meals pale by comparison, let's say. Because the next meal isn't that one. Or if you have that meal again, yeah, but it wasn't like the first time now, was it? Do you know what I'm saying? It's astonishing when you actually pay attention to it. There actually is there's virtually no moments of just landing in the ordinary mind stream of a typical person. There's constant restless seeking. It's like one of those little hamster wheels, you know, and in the front there's something attractive that you're trying to run towards, and behind you is something scary you're trying to run away from, and it doesn't really matter which one is the driver at a given moment, but there's this constant running in motion. And when the churn is happening like that, you don't have time to think. You don't have time to feel or reflect or even get in touch with what you're actually experiencing, because it's just the light show is flickering too damn fast, you know. Some of you are young enough that you wouldn't remember or never knew, but there used to be these things called films. And it was a film. It was literally film. And on each film, there was a frame. Remember this? There was a frame, and on each frame, there was a still picture. And then, believe it or not, the way it used to work is there was a light source, and the light source would have a cone or something, and the film would go by real fast, and then the light source would project on the wall a horse that was moving. Completely freaky. Moving pictures, movies. In fact, there are stories, this is really interesting and kind of a little cul-de-sac, but what the hell? There are stories from back in the 1800s when the variety shows of minstrelsy and so on would tour our country, and everybody was hearing the same songs and listening to the same stories, and they started to introduce these moving picture experiences. And there were a lot of recordings of this where they would charge you, 2 pennies, and you would take your date in there, and everybody would sit in the tent, and the big handlebarred person with the top hat would say, "All right, everybody, here it goes. Watch out for the magic." Woo-hoo. And the lights would go off, and then she'd grab you. "What's happening, honey?" Which is why you go. And then this image would appear, and it's a set of train tracks. And suddenly, you didn't know it, but your tent that you're sitting in was placed right on train tracks. It's not fair. There was no warning about this, but this is what's happening. And not only is there train tracks, but there's a train on the tracks, and it's coming this way. And so the piano starts with its diminished chords, and the train, right? Little dude's making sound, woo, woo. But you don't notice that because it's a light show and you've never seen anything like this before in your life. You've never seen a picture move. This defies physics. This doesn't happen. And so as the train gets closer and closer, the nervous laughter starts to turn into concern, and it gets closer and closer, and then there's anxiety starts to show up in the room, and then suddenly the train gets really close, and some people faint, some people run out of the room screaming, and then the movie's over, and everybody goes, "What just happened?" And out you go, in with the next. But for 2 pennies, you can come back and see it again. So what's happening there? Well, what's happening is the mind is encountering phenomenon that it doesn't really understand, and it gets completely carried away by them. Completely fictional, by the way. Obviously, we know the little tent is not actually on train tracks. We know, but they didn't know. They never saw it before. And so once we understand something about how this works, you relate to it differently. You can sit there in the theater and yes, you see the same images as the people around you. But like if any one of us were to sort of time warp back there, we'd find it all quite amusing. Wouldn't it be cute? Can you imagine it's the same experience though. So in a way, language is like that. The Buddha said there's an operating system in your mind that when you don't see how it works, it puts on this light show, and it scares the bejesus out of you. Real scare. because it's in your mind. But the good news is that there's a way to see through it. There's a way to actually realize, oh wait, this is just a light show. And at that point, you can engage with it quite freely. Does it make sense? So this question of how do you think and act with the pure mind, again, it has to do with how do we see reality as it actually is? How do we engage in life without letting unexamined conditioning kind of pull the strings? Because that's what happens, see. We have conditioning, stuff our teachers taught us, our parents, religious leaders, government folks, whatever. Peer pressure from the neighborhood kids back when neighborhoods had kids. And so as we go about our lives, the obvious thing to do seems to come up, and yet it keeps causing us this unsatisfactory deal. I did all the right things. What's happening? And so even though the Buddha didn't reference the light show in any of the teachings, that's basically what he's saying. We need to learn how to see through the mechanisms that are causing this horror show and this sort of funhouse mirror camp of supposedly delighting things. Because then we're able to actually be of use. Imagine someone in that tent back in 1820 or whatever, 1870, and they start to have an actual heart attack in fear, where people stampede out and people get trampled. Now, of course, this is ridiculous, but it's not to the people that are in the situation. They think they're going to get run over by a train and they need to get out right now. So an awakened person, so to speak, if you could teleport back there, you'd be able to say, hey, it's okay. It's all right, this is just a light show. You're fine, really, watch. Here, I put this card up and the train stops. See, it's not there. And nobody needs to get trampled. No one needs to have a heart attack. But you can still enjoy the show. I like movies, some more than others. So the awakened people that I've had the great fortune to know and to study with are people that can kind of see the light show for what it is. And they're still participating in it. They still care about society and families and everything that you would expect an adult, mature person to care about. But at the same time, there's not this buying into the idea that if I just have this one meal, I'll forever be happy. Or if I have this career, then I'll be happy. Or if I get these letters behind my name, then all will be well. You know how that'll work out. If I could just get this diagnosis to go away, then everything would be well. If I could get my kid to actually just grow up, wouldn't that be great? I mean, it goes on, this stack. And I would add, if only our country could have reasonable, intelligent conversation about viable policy options based on fact, and have reasonable, good faith conversations about ways to proceed to make society better for everyone. I'd love to see that shit happen. It's not happening right now. At least it's largely not happening. So what do? Do you just say, well, I'm not playing this game and not care? No. I'm a parent. I care about my daughter's future. Again, how do we engage? Well, what would a bodhisattva do in that light show? They would show up and be a voice of calm, and they would feel that even though they can see plainly that the actual causes of concern are mythical here, the stress is not. The stress is very real. And because the stress is real and the scare is real and the feeling is real, the bodhisattva will reach out and be of use and be of help. But how do we see the light show? Interesting parallel with Plato's cave, for those who might have looked in the Western tradition. How do you see what's true? So for this, the Buddha said, okay, you have to recognize that everything is a little bit not satisfactory. Even when it's exquisitely the way you would love it to be, it's impermanent. And let's face it, most of it is not as exquisite the way I'd like it to be. So even worse, right? So notice that there's a cause to this dissatisfaction, like the reason why things seem to not land. There's a cause for that. And the cause of that can be recognized and realized and seen through. So here the Buddha is seen as very much a physician kind of character, rather than a prophet, let us say, or someone who has access to divine revelation that no one else does, and you have to believe that or suffer for not believing it. Instead, what we have is the model of a physician that says, okay, there's an illness here, there's a cause to the illness, and there's a way we can actually treat that cause so the illness doesn't happen anymore. And it's very simple. As soon as you recognize that, oh, it's a light show, there's actually not a train on the tracks, you're no longer in mortal fear for your life. The kind of analogies the Buddha actually used, relevant to his day. In the area of Nepal, where we're pretty sure he lived, tigers were a serious thing. Like a land shark who's come and grab you, you know. And it was like scary. And I mean, tigers can be intense, obviously. You ever seen them in the zoo? And you're like, I'm glad the glass wall's there, frankly. I like my cat being about that size. It works out. But the Buddha said, suppose that you have the village and the elder is walking around and sees a tiger there and runs and runs out of fear and runs right into a tree because it's dark and they don't see. And then they knock themselves out and they're laying there, right? And they wake up in the morning and they look around to see where the tiger is, and it's not a tiger, it's just a bush. It was moving in the wind. And then all at once the person realizes, oh, there actually was no tiger there at all. It was a bush in the wind. Or the same analogy appears elsewhere where he says, imagine a person is walking at night and cobras and snakes are there and they're poisonous. And so you see one on the road and you run to get away. And again, you're running at night, so you run into a tree and you knock yourself out and you wake up and find it's just rope. It's not actually a snake. All of these analogies, there's a bunch of them, but they all point to this essential misperceiving of what is actually happening. It's not that we should kill all the tigers or ban all snakes or make movies illegal or force everyone to watch the kind of movies we like. Rather, it's let the mind become clear about how it's actually functioning. And the fear by itself will dissipate. You don't have to believe anything, but you have to see clearly. And you have to trust yourself. Because your senses are telling you that train is coming right at you. That's what it looks like. That's what it sounds like. But that's not actually what's happening. So that conditioning that we take on, that is kind of drilled into us or that we pick up, usually non-consensually, usually it's just by environment, that conditioning is like the light show. And we believe it to be true. And we will die fighting for it. Which is about as intelligent as one of those folks in that tent dying, fighting for their right to trample themselves to get out of there because the train's going to kill them all. So it's kind of an intense situation. If you think about animals, as far as we know, most of them, they're operating on more of an instinctual level, depending up to how far evolved they are. And we think that most of the animals don't really have a sense of themselves as a self. There's exceptions to this. The cuttlefish, we think maybe some dolphins, perhaps chimps, perhaps bonobos. There's some query about, some of these creatures are advanced enough that they can actually look in a mirror and recognize that it's themselves. And that's kind of an interesting thing. But let's say by and large, the birds and the fish and the bees and stuff, my pug probably has no sense. At least he has no sense of his mortality. I do. He's 15. That's pretty old for a pug. So what the Buddha cautions us to do, or advises us to do, is to learn how to be still. And even in the most turbulent times, in the most difficult settings, in the most challenging environments, the counsel is to learn how to actually be still and to be silent, and learn how to pay attention in a very specific and clear way to the actual functioning of your own awareness. That's where you start. Really interrogating your perception. And here, I do not mean a classic Freudian psychoanalysis. I'm talking about actually paying attention to how your experience of life works. How do you actually experience yourself? How do you experience life? And so in any of the many Buddhist traditions, and they're all lovely, I bow to them all, they will all have this teaching about unsatisfactoriness and the cause of it and the cure of it and this eightfold path. Everybody has that in common. And it really starts and ends with what's called right view. And right view is simply seeing correctly what's actually happening in your own perception. So this is like several steps back from arguing alternative policy decisions, right? This is way before that. And so silence and stillness becomes very important. Now, interestingly, I really don't think Buddhism has any corner on the market here. I think in any tradition or society, you'll find some folks who have found a way to appreciate and develop stillness and silence and contemplative intelligence. They'll have different language for it based on their culture and the time that they're in. A 16th century Spaniard will not speak of it the same way a 6th century Chinese person will, just by language and cultural difference. But the actual experience of silence and paying attention in this particular way has always been available. And so we learn how to be still and to pay attention and to wield our awareness in really critically examining how our experience of reality is happening. Like, what is actually our experience? The sound of the plane, the light coming in, the feeling of gravity affecting the body. How is that happening? And so you can think of your attention like a flashlight. So if I say, listen to the plane. You can take your mind's attention, the flashlight of your awareness, and you can turn it onto the sound of the propellers in the engine. And you can put your mind there, is the way we would say it. If I say, oh, let me bring your attention to look at the foliage out there, isn't it cool? It is cool, check it out, it's amazing. So right now what's happening is the flashlight of my attention is going out to the foliage, and I'm going, man, that's really pleasing. So maybe I hear the sound of the plane and I think, oh, I don't like that. It sounds machine-like and oily, and it's environmentally not good, and smoke and stuff, and planes crash, bad stuff. And then I look at the foliage and I think, oh, I love that, how the light is glistening through the trees and it's so pretty, I feel good now. Or I could hear the plane and say, oh, I remember that trip to Scotland. That was so fun. This journey of a lifetime with my family. Oh, I remember travel was such a delicious thing. And I see the leaves and I go, oh God, it's getting cold and dark now. Oh. So what happened there? You've got two sensory experiences, the audible sound of the plane and the visual seeing of the foliage and the sun, and you've got two radically different stories being told about what it means, right? But most of the time, we never interrogate that. We just go, oh, there's a stupid plane and there's a beautiful leaf. And we just move right along as though that's true. Like, in some ontological sense, that's the truth. It may very well be our reaction to it. But what is the pure experience of just hearing the plane? What is the pure experience of just seeing the leaves or hearing the words or feeling your body on the earth? It turns out that it's like there's a treasure map with a big X on it, and where the X is in your experience of very simple things. And so in the Buddhist tradition, we learn to sit and to be still, and we learn to pay very deep and meticulous attention to our experience. So meditation becomes a central key in this tradition, not to trying to become something that we aren't, but rather to notice what's been happening, to be able to see the algorithm, I suppose, of our experience and see how it actually plays out. And then we're free to have whatever associations we care to with planes or foliage or whatever else. If we don't really see the mechanism of our mind correctly, then a little bit we're like those kind of cute people who are giving themselves heart attacks and trampling each other, trying to flee the train that's coming through the wall. The drama and the suffering is real, the causes are fiction. So we're taught the value of concentration. The Buddha says you must learn to concentrate the mind. The mind is an instrument, you could say, and you need to keep it tuned, and you need to know how to wield it. And so a typical mind, like this flashlight, imagine yourself in a completely darkened room, and you've got your flashlight, and that's where your attention is, and wherever you look is where the light goes. And if you hear a scary sound, you're going to go, ooh, and you're going to look to see. And if you smell something delicious, you're going to look and see what that could be. And so you're kind of on that hamster wheel. You're running away from or towards sense experience. And this comes through things that you see, that you hear, that you taste, sensations of the body, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and also thoughts are like this. Initially, it seems like the senses are all externally facing. But we come to realize pretty quickly when we start to sit that actually the vast majority of the activity is mental. And so people that practice this stuff and they get into it might think that when they start doing a bit of Zen training that suddenly their minds are all very active and crazy. You know, they sit still for 20, 30 minutes and pay attention and come out and say, this is crazy. Now my mind is all over the place. And actually what's true is that your mind has always been all over the place. You've just never noticed it. So when we start to actually notice it for the first time, it can be quite the revelation. And it's, interestingly enough, it's not coming from outside. I'm not telling you something that you don't already know and you're having to believe it. Rather, there's a way of practicing and working with your mind that allows you to notice your own experience in a really deep way. And then that experience is yours. It didn't come to you from the outside. It came from you paying attention to your own experience. Because ultimately, if any teacher were to sit up here and rattle off the points you need to know to spit back on the exam to get an A, we know how to do that. But actually having the wisdom apply in our lives is a whole separate thing. You have to have your own experience, not just ideas about it. And so we learn techniques to sit and pay attention in non-judgmental awareness. Take the light of your intention and your attention and decide that you're actually going to shine that light on your own breathing. Sounds are still perceived, sights are still noticed, thoughts still rise and fall. But in the midst of that, it's possible to actually just pay attention to your breathing. And so we learn to keep the flashlight on the breath. And as we do that, excuse me, we're not shutting the world off. It's not closing everything off. Allow the world to world right along. Allow the internal landscape to continue doing what it's doing. Thoughts can certainly rise up. They will. Feelings will come and go. It's fine. I have a lot of music in my mind. Music will play. That's fine. Just, I keep the flashlight of my attention on my breathing. I'm choosing to pay attention to the breathing. I don't have to go and tell the plane to stop doing that so I can meditate. I don't have to go and tell the leaves to quit dangling their beauty as a temptation before me. Stop it. And then I can meditate. This is silliness. Rather, I can sit down exactly in the body that I'm in right now and in the environment that I'm in, and I can still choose to pay attention to the breathing. And as we do this, it seems very simple. To describe it, it might sound like a complete non-event. After all, I've been breathing my whole life. I'm quite good at it. I'm quite the accomplished breather, as a matter of fact. 55 years running, in my case. But that's not sufficient. It's like sometimes people say, oh, you play guitar? I play guitar. Well, that's great. How long have you been playing? Oh, I got my first guitar in like 2000. And so they'll say, oh, I've played for 24 years. But that's not actually accurate. How many hours have you played your guitar? Oh, about 2 hours a year. Oh, okay. You played for 48 hours in 24 years. So you've been breathing a long time, but how many breaths have you actually noticed? you know? Most of us, most of the time, breathing isn't something that demands a lot of our attention, you know? I suppose unless you've ever been in a situation where you can't breathe, has anyone been in that situation? That's spooky, right? Like, you know, a little choking, or you're underwater and the ceiling isn't quite where you think it's going to be, and the panic comes in for a second, or whatever else, asthma attacks, right? But we get through that, and then, oh, thank God I don't have to think about it again. So, interestingly enough, in Zen practice, we pay a lot of attention to the breathing. But the way in which we pay attention to the breathing is not some kind of athletic control freak thing. You're not being a drill sergeant with your own breathing. You're simply letting the breath breathe itself and choosing to pay attention to it. So really what we're doing is we're using the breath as an object of attention. Does it make sense? Now, there are others, and if you look at spiritual and contemplative traditions, I think people are great. People come up with all kinds of things to work with and work on. Some traditions will use a candle flame. Some traditions will use like a scroll that's got a cool thing on it, you know, all kinds of stuff. There are ways of working with sound as a primary entry gate. But all in all, the Zen tradition says, you know, paying attention to the breath is the best way in. Mindfulness of breath, it's called. And so as we breathe in, we want to pay deep, exquisite attention to every bit of the experience of that breath, without shutting anything else off or making enemies of planes and leaves. Allow the plane to plane right along, allow the leaves to keep leafing along. Thoughts can come and go, but we're going to take the flashlight of our attention and hold it on that breath. And we're going to use it as a practice. And so the Buddha taught practices. Like a physician, like a physical therapist will say, oh my gosh, your knees are giving you trouble. Here's some PT exercises for you. Right? And now this is part of your life. This is what I do now. I have my stretches and my exercises, these embarrassing bands that defeat me and I have to work with. So in a way, it's like that. The Buddha gives certain practices that are the antidotes for specific diseases of the mind. And the primary disease of the mind is mistaking a moving picture show for a train that's going to kill you, and then hurting yourself and others as a result. If we can see the picture show for the picture show, then we have different choices that we can make about how we're going to be. You can enjoy the picture show, it's fine. Or you can leave because it's not interesting. But you're sure not going to trample anybody on the way out. And so as we pay attention to the breathing and we keep our flashlight of our awareness into the experience of breathing, at every nanosecond along the way presents opportunities for distraction. Yet more planes, more leaves, more music, or whatever it is that's in your world at this time. Anticipation or grief or, you know, the parade of joys and sorrows, concerns, the stories of being the hero or being the victim or whatever it is. And the teaching is very specific. Allow those stories to play, allow the planes to plane, but you keep the awareness in that breathing. And what's interesting is you find that you cannot do it. You find this is not possible. It sounds easy enough. If I said, oh, you know, here, take this card and hold it like that, you can just do that. You can, if you have access to an arm that works, you can hold this thing up and you can just go ahead and will yourself to do it. If I say let it go, you can let it go. It's easy enough. If I say sit still, many of us have the ability to sit still for a little while anyway. You can just sort of not fidget around a little bit. But if I say keep your awareness on your breath, off we go. And it can be startling how unable we actually are to control where this flashlight goes. And here we begin to get some real insight into where the suffering comes from. Because if the scary thought has more gravitational pull than your own center does, then when you're sitting here trying to concentrate on your breathing and the scary thought comes up, the flashlight will go right to the scary thought, or the righteous thought, or the indignant thought, or whatever it is. Because it's sexier, it's got more charge, it's more compelling. It keeps you there, is what it really does. And so the process is repeated hundreds of times in this community. Someone will come in, they'll seek practice, they'll be given beginning instruction. Sounds easy enough. Sit down, posture, fine, breathing, okay. Pay attention to the breath. And then seconds later, they're completely unaware of their breathing. And it might take you 5 minutes to realize it. That's what's even crazier. You can be sitting there literally right now looking like you're looking at me, but actually be watching a movie in your head. True or false? Right? Like you can sit there dutifully looking at the teacher. Meanwhile, secretly in the deep recesses of your mind, you are quite elsewhere. I'm a professional teacher, I know this. And frankly, some teachers deserve no less, and I agree. Hopefully I'm not one of them, but you know. But really, more important than paying attention to some person in some position of supposed authority, what you really want to be able to do is to pay attention to your own experience, because you decide it's worth doing, not because somebody tells you to. So if faith means anything in this tradition, it's faith in the fact that this is worth doing a solid experiment with. That's about it. Now, do the thing. And so as we sit and attempt to hold the flashlight of our awareness to our breathing, and it gets pulled away by typically scary, sometimes enticing, goes back and forth. Sights, sounds, smells, tastes, sensations of the body, feelings, emotional, thoughts, intellectual, all of this moving stuff will pull you around. And the flashlight will go out to them. And then when you see, there's a moment of recognition that occurs when your mind has left the object of your concentration and has gotten pulled into a story. A big dark story, a big black hole of terribleness comes to mind, and then your awareness goes, and you're stuck to the scary thing, okay? And then you don't know what's happening. Time goes by, and then you suddenly go, wait a minute, I'm not counting my breath anymore. I'm playing with the horror show. So what you do is you see the horror show, you acknowledge the horror show, you let the horror show go, and bring your awareness back into your own center and into your own experience of breathing. Notice, I'm not saying that you pound this into the ground and make an enemy of it. That'll just make it stronger. Simply allow it to kind of do whatever it's going to do over there, but you're paying attention to the breath. This might come and knock you on the head a little bit and want to play. And once you train it that you're not going to engage, it will just dissipate. It'll just, like a cloud, it'll go away. And so the breath is still there. And sometimes it's a Not a scary one, it's a cool one. Ooh, look at the nice book. What's in there? Oh, the answers. So you're sitting and, story time, right? Now, this is attractive. This one is spooky. This one's attractive. It doesn't matter. Zen meditation is not about stacking happy, fluffy things to think about. Buddhist-y thoughts. This is not the point. In fact, if you're sitting there thinking Buddhist-y thoughts, smack. It's not going to help you at all. Cut that out. Rather, pay attention to the breathing, let us say. So leave the enticing cover alone and unopened and let the horror show just do whatever it's doing over there. But you're staying in your own bodily experience. Now think about the effect of that. If one were able to actually sit still for, let's say, 20, 30 minutes, and actually develop the skill of holding your mind's attention exactly where you want it to be for as long as you want it to be there, without trying to shut the world off or shut your senses down or play whack-a-mole with all the thoughts, but actually you can do it. It turns out, with a certain amount of experience, the only reason you can't do it in the beginning is you don't know where the controls to this craft are. You've just been kind of bumped around like a bumper car with no steering wheel your whole life, and you didn't know it. And you realize, wait a minute, there's a steering wheel, there's a brake, and there's a gas, and I can actually guide this thing. Not just because the situation is compelling, but because you're deciding to. Many people come into Zen training because they tumble into a deeply concentrated state with the arts, say, or some kind of physical discipline, say, or with some kind of situation that is very pleasing or very scary, let's say, and they experience a deeply concentrated state. It can come upon you, say you're in the car on 23 or 475 and it's icy and you start to skid. Anybody ever have that experience? Things become very real very fast. Like a lot of people will immediately move into a deeply concentrated state where it seems like time is different and right? And like you get through it like, oh my God, what was that? And then your heart starts racing. So these kind of deeply immersive and concentrated experiences are fundamentally human. They're part of the human experience. But usually it's completely situationally dependent and we don't know how to steer it. It kind of happens to us. And so we think it's the rock climbing wall. That's where the energy is. Or it's the being on stage. That's where the energy is. But it's not. It's your mind. Those are just different setups that enable you to allow yourself to get deep until it doesn't work anymore. And so over time, we gain experience with being centered and with having equanimity in the midst of churn and drama and real actual challenge, not just light show imaginal challenge like the real stuff. It's not a show. There is a train. It is on the tracks and you're stuck there. Now what? Even in that situation, and so with experience comes confidence. And we begin to feel that more and more we can actually guide where our concentration is going. You can imagine the concern that I may have around social media and young people and phones and the inability for folks to even read an email anymore. Some of you may not know, I'm a professor at UT. It's my day job. I'm interacting with young kids all the time. There is kind of a palpable erosion going on. A tweet is too much to read. It's a different issue, but important, I think, for our society. But for us, the ability for us to put our mind where we want it to be is, the Buddha says, a developable skill. And this is actually the most important thing. This is far more important than getting the talking points for your politically unaligned uncle at Thanksgiving. I'm going to hit him with these facts and it's going to be great. You may hit him with the facts, it's not going to be great. What actually you can rely on is developing your concentration and paying attention to your own experience. Those are dials and levers and switches you can actually reach, and you can do something with those. Uncle Bob, Uncle John, Uncle Fred, not so much. And so by learning the feeling of what it feels like to be in a groove and to have the mind locked into the breath and merging with the breath, we feel what it's like to have the mind be yanked around by shiny or prickly objects. And just by sheer experience, we're not into it anymore. You don't have to attack by attack respond. It just simply happens quite naturally, very, very naturally over time. You're just not interested in playing with those toys anymore. They're not that interesting. Some things are very interesting, but those aren't not amongst them. So interestingly, the antidote to difficult times is to recognize the times are not difficult, it's the mind that's difficult. And then how do I address a difficult mind, a difficult heart? We must begin by learning how to focus our attention correctly. And we have to accept that we can do this badly. We have to accept the fact that it's possible to be unable to control our awareness at all, and that causes us suffering. Once that little bit of cognitive leap is made, you have all the nutrition you need to start saying, I think I would like to explore what it is to have a little more custody over my awareness. Did you ever see any of these things come through your social media feed or the news that are just make your blood boil? Have you noticed anything like that? They're designed to. That's exactly what it's trying to do. It wants you to be pissed off or afraid. Why? Because that goes right into the lower brain and it triggers your reptilian self and you're in. And that's all that matters to those platforms, that you're engaged. Happens to be these toxic, scary things work the best, so they float to the top. We all thought that if information was freely available, the truth would sift to the top. It doesn't. It sinks to the bottom, buried by a cesspool of crap. It's just what happens, It's not... the truth is complicated and it's messy and it's painful. And stories that get your hackles up are cheap and quick and easy. So all the more important reason for us to learn to know what it feels like when something is trying to yank that chain and be like, no, I don't do that. Collar off, not into that stuff. No thanks. So this ability to concentrate the mind, it begins with us as a witness shining the light of our awareness on an object. And that's how it starts. And honestly, if most people did that, it would be a very different world we would live in. Just that. This is amazing. How many young people can't get themselves to get an idea of what they would like to experience, and then follow through with it. And so they become subject to other people's ideas because they don't have one. You know, if you don't have a plan, you'll fall in line with somebody else if they have a plan for you. And it's not personal. They don't care about you at all. They just want you to buy their stuff. Right? So interestingly then, imagine that you say, okay, this makes some sense. Think and act with the pure mind. I understand this means see things as they are. I understand this means I have to learn to focus my mind correctly. And I understand that this means I'm going to practice this by paying attention to my breathing. And so like learning to play the guitar or the fiddle or being good at bowling or chess, you practice the skill and you get good at it. Then some really strange things can happen. And I'll stop talking there. No. Then some very strange things can happen. That's really interesting. Because sometimes, if you really get into a concentrated state, and typically this happens on retreat called sesshin, where people gather here in this space to do a couple of days or a week of intensive meditation practice together. And it can occur in times like that, that when you put period on top of period on top of period of zazen, that the mind can settle into a very deeply concentrated state, the likes of which it typically cannot access in a simple 20-minute in the morning, 20-minute at night kind of program. Learning how to sit that well opens different levels of awareness. So with the very same practice, the very same paying attention, you could imagine it like, say you love the way the leaves play in the wind, and you could just sit here and look out the window and look at those leaves and just pay attention to them. Like, you know, see those leaves? They're actually doing it right now quite handsomely. You know, there's the wind, there's the leaves. And let's say you're just sitting on the porch in your favorite rocking chair with a little taste of bourbon or whatever you like, a little tea, and you're just really watching that. You know, my Uncle John had a farm, and I used to sit on his porch and watch the corn. You know, the wind would blow and the corn would kind of go like that, like waves. It's amazing, one of my earliest memories. Vast, to me, field. And you could just see the wind kind of moving through and the clouds. Amazing. Or say you're at the beach, you know, you're a water person, fine. So you're at the beach and you're sitting there with your toes in the sand and the waves are kind of washing up, you know. And you can just sit there and just pay attention. And just, not like you're doing this thing, but you just naturally, you're just attentive to the waves. You let the waves go ahead and wave. You don't make them all be the same. You don't get out there and manage them and scold them for being bad waves and get them to line up, you know. These leaves are all doing fine. They don't all have to fall at the same time. It's okay. They're all going to land exactly right. Yeah? But then something else can happen. Perhaps you've had a taste of this somewhere, where it's not just you staring at the leaves and noticing them, but in a certain way, a kind of concentrated state of mind arises where the sense of yourself as a separate self watching this thing out there vanishes. Now, objectively, you are sitting here watching, looking at over there. That's obviously the case. But in your perception, it doesn't stay like that. In your perception, you can perceive that you actually are the leaves, that there's no gap between you and what it is that you're watching. So that beautiful being at the farm and seeing the sky and the clouds and the birds and the corn doing all this moving with the wind and stuff and the sound of it, right? There's, you know, Jay sitting there watching this happen. And then as a young person, it ceased to be my experience that I was there looking at that, but rather there was just this. And I'm not separate from it in my experience. Now, if you took a picture, little Jay is still sitting on the porch, and the corn is in fact over there, and Jay's over here. But in my experience, that's not how it feels. It feels as though the gap between what's being perceived and the perceiver dissipates so much that there's no longer a sense of a separate self. We say that that's a non-dual experience, meaning non-dualistic, meaning it's not I, thou. And be clear, it has to do with how you're perceiving things. And that non-dual kind of experience is a whole other level of relief from suffering. That's a level of relief from the suffering that simple mindfulness and concentration can't really reach by itself. And here's why. When you encounter something, let's say we're sitting here looking at the leaves, and we're maybe going nearly all the way, if not fully merging and just being the moment beautifully. And then you suddenly notice that someone walks up and is standing behind you. You can feel them standing there, right? Suddenly, like, your sense of yourself comes back in full force. And like, why is this dude standing right here? What's up, man? Oh, yeah, sure. And then you have the conversation. But that felt sense of that person's presence changed your perspective. And so rather than just merging with nature, now I'm me again, and there's a them. There's an I and a thou. Does it make sense? Or like if you're watching a show and suddenly the phone rings and you're no longer in the Shire, now you're dealing with, oh my God, my mom's calling, what's wrong? Are you okay? Okay? So in a very similar way, the light show of attractions and horrors from which we run to and away keeps us in that constantly agitated space of self. And that space of self-referential awareness is exhausting, very expensive. Because as soon as there's a line to where I am, then there will be battles. Me versus you. Resources I need, I have to take from you. I've got to get you to think this way, not that way. All of the battles happen because of the lines. And I'm speaking here of your own experience. So you can be sitting in meditation and you can actually slip into a very deeply non-dual state with the breath itself, so that the breath is the entire cosmos. There's just this breath breathing itself. And there's no one who knows anything about it. There's no witness, there's no commentator, there's no meaning maker, there's no novel being written here. There's simply this breath. Or you can sit there watching the breath, noticing when your attention gets pulled away and bringing it back, bringing it back, bringing it back. Or you can sit there and have your attention be hijacked by damn well anything. Little sound bites of old movies, little horrible moments from high school, for God's sake. the hit parade of triumphs and pitfalls, most people most of the time are in that category. Most people most of the time are willing to kill each other over the light show. That's my train. You can't have it. Complete fiction. Actually, there's no there, but the blood is real, the damage is real, the suffering is real. That's real. What's being contested over, these rival God concepts? Come on. You know? But seriously, we're almost professional at it. There are some who would say that this is a factor of our evolutionary process, wherein our ancestors that were able to cohere around a fiction were able to prevail against the ancestors that could not. So we have the myth of the standard of Rome, let us say, the eagle, the standard. And how do you get all those young men to go and slaughter other young men when they don't even know each other or these other people? Well, you get them to believe in a fiction like Rome or money. And you get us all to agree on this fiction, and we'll go and march to war around it. In fact, war requires these fictions, I would say. It's very unnatural. People generally, I think, don't want to hurt each other. We're just not like that. We don't go around our days looking for ways to pillage and maim and rape and steal. I mean, come on. A very few of us, perhaps, they're very unwell. Vast majority of people want nothing to do with that. I'm sure you've seen the studies of your average Nazi guard and how they related to their family, right? It's very confusing until you realize, well, the easiest thing to do to get a large group of folks to behave badly is to give them a fiction to rally around. And it works. And that's what I see happening today. There are a lot of fictions being run up the flagpole and in fact seem to have nothing to do with it. And in fact, a lot of the people knowingly don't care about facts or truth in any way. What they want is they want that fiction and they want it now. Do you know what I mean? So to start, we've got to be able to see the fictions that we tell ourselves that have been unexamined, that are actually the operating system of how we navigate our life. What does it mean to you when your sister goes on a trip and doesn't tell you about it, or whatever it is? What does it mean to you? How do you respond when? And so this business of non-dual experience, when either you have mindful experience where there's a subject and an object, and that's cool, or you get into the non-dual where the subject-object merges or dissipates, however you want to see it. The value of those states is that it gives us a deeper bench to gauge our own intuitions by. When you learn how to put yourself into a deeply non-dual state, you're much harder to fool with some fiction. It just doesn't work anymore. It's not compelling. It's just like, are you kidding me? And they're not kidding. It works with a lot of people, but not with you. It doesn't mean that you mystically know the correct policy answer to every question anyone can throw at you. It doesn't mean that you know all the statistics and data by heart. If you have the kind of mind that knows that stuff, you will. If you don't, you're not going to. But what you are very clear about is how you're seeing the world. And you can trust that. Now, one of the things that happens with that non-dual experience is that our sense of ourself, rather than being filled with boundaries and borders and lines, we see that it's actually this vast open space It's this vast open sky. Clouds come and go, storms come and go, gentle spring breezes or big hurricane winds. None of those things actually hurt the sky. None of those things actually scrape the sky. The sky's fine. Clouds, no clouds, the sky is the sky. The sky is perfect, complete, lacks nothing. It doesn't mind. Birds can fly right on through, and planes too, it's okay. And this experience of the awakening of the self has to do with seeing that you're not a little cloud that has to fight to keep itself together, but rather you're the sky that's always been fine and always will be fine. And clouds come and go. You can see it as though the Buddha talks about the waves on the ocean. And you imagine that a wave on the ocean is, let's say, evolves enough to sprout eyes and ears and a nose. Funny wave, but there it is. It's up on the ocean, and it evolves a nervous system and a brain, let's say, some way of cognizing. And so this wave, because it suddenly has senses, because it can sense things, now it starts to freak out. Ooh, what's happening? Wait a minute. And it looks around and it sees bigger waves and it feels jealous. It sees smaller waves and it feels superior. It sees faster waves and it wants to compete. It's so tired of being a wave, can't go on. But above all, it sees this shore coming ever closer and closer. And it sees the other waves hit the shore and dying. Oh, we're all gonna die. And all the other waves are looking around going, oh no, oh God. And they're all rolling to the shore and the shore just eats them all alive. Horrible, horrible stress. Great drama. So one of the waves raises up a story. I am the great blue wave, follow me. Yes, yes. And they all try to follow the blue wave. It's not going to help at all. No, I'm the red wave, follow me. This is the answer. Oh, that way. No, it's not the answer there either. But one wave says, you know, this is stupid. I'm just not going to do that. And it takes those eyes, it puts on some goggles and a little mask, and it looks down. You have a visual. I used to love that as a kid. My friends would go in the pool and they'd play Marco Polo or whatever. I would put on the fins and the mask and go to the bottom and just sit there. I loved it. Anyway, this one wave, gives this radical idea to take the senses instead of running out, being afraid of the shore or feeling superior to the other waves. It takes those same senses and turns the flashlight of its awareness inside. And it looks in. What does it see? It sees that it's water. It's always been water. And not only that, the wave sees quite clearly that all the other waves are also, in fact, water. And in fact, they're all the same water. Like, dude, we're an ocean. Dude. And instantly, when that wave has this awakening experience and sees its own nature and sees that it's water, it has no more concern. These lines with battles, they're just stupid now. There's just nothing to be afraid of. I mean, nothing's going to happen. In fact, there's not even a wave there. if it really watches very closely, it'll see that there is no permanent set wave. We know this. It's a force of movement that energy goes through. Different molecules move up and down, but there's no thing that moves. Do you know what I'm saying? We ordinarily say, oh, here comes a wave. We know what we mean. But in fact, on close interrogation, there's no such thing. There's no wave there as a fixed thing. There's a process that's unfolding, but each instant of that wave's life is a different incarnation with different cells and different molecules of water. There's some force that's continuing, but each one is its own millisecond by millisecond expression. And so imagine the relief. I'm fine. It's okay. And then you come back up and you look around and all the other waves are still going, ah, quick, team blue, team red, ah. And the waves are fighting, holding rallies. Making bigger lines to have bigger wars around. But this one wave that is seen into the actual nature of the ocean itself was like, y'all are being dumbass. We don't need to be doing this. In fact, that wave will instantly have real, true compassion. Compassion in the truest sense, karuna. Karuna means based on an experience of realization, I see clearly that you and I are not separate. Not because it sounds good or I wish it was this way, but actually because I've seen it for myself. I've put on the goggles, gone under and looked up, and I can see we're all just expressing the same wave. It's this, and you come back up, and all the waves are in fact different. There are faster and slower and bigger and smaller. It's true, but it's not the total truth. It's like that's a chunk of the truth, but it's not even the main truth. The main truth of the ocean is the ocean. What percentage of the ocean is this wave? Do you understand? It's about like that. And all this froth and churn is at this little level. It's really quite silly. Especially when you think about all the drama that is unnecessary that could be put towards educating the younger generations better, to like making better decisions about how we spend our resources, about what we do with our time and how we treat our elders and how we relate with other folks with whom we disagree. I mean, there's so many better things to be doing. And so that compassion comes immediately when the wave realizes, wait, actually, if any wave is panicking and sad, I'm panicking and sad. It's actually all me in unique and diverse expression. And this is a little bit the Zen part. Which is it? Is it one ocean or is it unique and diverse expression? Well, it's both at exactly the same moment. Both are exactly true. And so this seeing of the other waves as an extension of the self that is also suffering makes compassion the immediate response. And so the teaching of the Buddha is not just be still and concentrate and it'll give you some relief, although that's true. The Buddha did not leave a bunch of recorded guided meditations on tape that you're supposed to give the keys to your awareness over to and let them tell you what to think about and feel. It may be very lovely, but it will not give you the strength that you need to see into the water itself. The wave will never have the awakening experience if it's just like reads a book. Even if the book's about the ocean. Says here we're all water. Interesting. Water is H2O. Well, this little diagram of the molecules are very interesting. Yes. Water we think comes from here and goes there. Okay, no suffering is relieved, even if all those words are correct. The wave still is freaking out. When the wave experientially sees into its true self, then you're living in a more complete perspective. Not coming at you intellectually, but coming at you from your hara, from your center. The other great metaphor for this is the body itself. You know, if, say, this hand sort of perceived the other hand as an opponent somehow, it's all wrong. Look at the thumb. The thumb's all wrong over there. Fool. No, it's not. Yes, it is. Just like the Hatfields and the McCoys. I mean, to anyone else, they're the same, but to them, life and death. Right? The Sunni and the Shia, the Azerbaijan and the Armenian. I mean, it just, in a lot of ways, the closer we are, the more violent we get, which is a little spooky, but that's happens. Anyway, if this hand got, you know, the coffee's too hot and it got stuck somehow, this hand would like to help, but it won't because it might get hurt too, so you're on your own. And we can see the ridiculous folly of that, but the hands can't. But now if you take this hand and you awaken it, instead of just sensing what's outside and whether it's pleasing or not pleasing or neutral, if we can take the senses of this hand and put them in so that the hand pays attention to, say, its own blood and the marrow of its bones, and it can follow the bone marrow down, there's a lot more going on than the hand knew. And in fact, if it can follow all the way down, it'll see that it's the same body as the other one. And there's compassion. Yes, this is the right hand, and yes, this is the left hand, and yes, it's one body. Well, which one is true? Isn't it kind of obvious? Both true. And we can actually learn and experience for ourselves the perspective of seeing people with whom we really disagree about serious stuff. But we can still, in the midst of that disagreement, see that it's one body. It doesn't mean the disagreements just evaporate, but we have a very different perspective on what the disagreement is and what it means, and most importantly, what we can do about it. After all, one of the most efficient ways to get your position traction is to have an enemy that you can rally people against. And the best way to rally people against an enemy is to dehumanize them. They're not people, they're vermin. Your problems, their fault. Your problems, their fault. Right? That's a fiction, like the Standard of Rome, and people will line up to it and salute it and do horrible things. But awakening shuts all that off. So what did the Buddha say to do in difficult times? Run and hide? No. Fight like hell? Not really. Buddha said, first thing, conquer yourself. Get very, very clear about what you're saying and thinking. And does it really hold up to the most intense scrutiny possible? Do you really see the perfection of things? Because everybody can see the difficulties, but can you see the inherent perfection of things? And once the answer to that is yes, then we have the option and the opportunity of engaging in the world in a way that can actually make a difference. Because it's not just trading one story for another story, for another story, for another story, but it's actually holding all the stories simply as stories. I'm a fan of stories. We need them. They're good stuff, some far better than others. But treat the stories as stories and treat the self as the self. And then we can create and use stories that are actually pure in the sense that they alleviate suffering for ourselves and for others. So I've been talking for about an hour and a half already, maybe an hour. How long has it been? I can't tell. 2 hours, excellent. What time are we supposed to be done? Oh, we're done in half an hour. Oh, God. Sorry about that. Okay, so if that's true, then I don't suppose we have time for a bio break, do we? We should probably just go to Q&A, no? Bio break wins. Let's take a quick 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and have some dialogue together. Thank you for the wisdom, Kensei.
Check, check.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. So, so let's do a little maybe Q&A time, and let's have some conversation together about anything that I've said or something that I didn't say that I should have, perhaps, or whatever comes to mind in light to this topic. Particularly if there's any guests who are brave and foolish enough to want to throw something out there, it'd be a lot of fun, it'd be fine. But everybody's welcome.
I have a good one to start.
Okay.
How do I deal with anger at lying? I struggle with that so much, especially at the library. I select books for the library, and when I get requests for things, that everything from the title to the last page is pure fabrication,
Yeah.
pretending to be reality, that I really struggle with that.
Yeah. I mean, do you have any institutional way of saying this is all just so much horseshit and no? Can you do that?
It's to the point now where we represent all viewpoints, and this is such, we cannot escape this viewpoint, and so if we don't represent it, it comes back to us, and so we're biased and we're woke and we don't represent everybody, and it's tricky. I just get so angry, and I never know what to do with that.
You know, it's tough. I think in this perspective, I'm actually conservative in the sense of believing in institutions and wanting to conserve and hold up the best of our institutions and to improve them from inside. So the university is a flawed system, clearly. But rather than just burn it all down, I think the answer is to work within the university to help the educational process unfold in an ever more full way, right? And the library is one of those institutions, you know, making credible knowledge available for everybody. I mean, it was a radical thing. I mean, I don't need to tell you this, but I mean, the idea of making human knowledge available, it's just it's a goosebump thing, you know. So I don't know, I'm not in the library system, but I would think that if I was in a situation, I would probably lean towards saying what actually is the case, which is that all viewpoints are welcome, but lies are not. And, you know, someone expressing their opinion about something is very different than putting out a book of just wrong information. You know, and I don't know if you're at liberty to make those decisions or not, but personally, I would take the heat. I'm not gonna say things from this platform in this little institution to make sure I appeal to everyone possible. I'm not. I'm going to say what I know is accurate based on my experience, and people that resonate hopefully will be here, and people that don't, it's okay with me. And that's probably not the exactly appropriate attitude for the library, but.
Unfortunately. Yeah. Ethically, yeah. But I just have such anger, and I've just struggled to know what to do with it.
Well, I mean, from a certain perspective, if I back away from the particulars, the sensation of anger that's rising is just another, it's just another phenomenon of experience. So my lust, my anger, my greed, my hatred, my disgust, my attraction, aversion, all the different feelings, loneliness, overcrowded with people, all the different sensations and feelings are actually things that are arising in mind. So the sky itself is unmarred even by anger at factless facts, right? So from that perspective, even the sense of a self to be outraged by it is another sense of experience. The sense of myself as a self is an experience that rises within mind, just like every other experience that rises in mind. And so from an individual person's point of view, I would counsel you to really just get really good at letting go of anger and irritation and attraction and greed and all the other things when you sit and apply it as best you can. As an institution, though, I'm not going to teach something in one of my university classes that I know is inaccurate and call it equal airtime. I don't know if that helps.
Truthiness, yeah. Thank you. Other questions?
Please.
I'd be curious to know, in light of what I see as a political situation now.
Yeah.
I mean, I can just pretend that I am, working on my clarity of mind and seeing, all the things that you spoke about. And meanwhile, there's sort of an undercurrent of evil, which has always been with people. What's the Buddha's teaching on evil? I mean, how does he approach that?
Well, evil is seen to be anything that increases suffering, right? And it certainly was around in his day. There's a famous example in the Pali tradition suttas that he was from a clan called the Shakya clan, and his dad, it was a minor player, and his dad wanted to take the kingdom level up by basically swallowing up a few other near kingdoms and kind of take them in, old story, right? And so there was a time when the Buddha was in his fully mature teaching career, and he got an urgent memo, hey, there's war. And these two clans that are really, it'd be like Sylvania and Perrysburg going to war. It's like, this is stupid. But there it is, about that far away from each other, honestly. And so he went in and he did an intervention. At that time, he was extraordinarily well known. And actually what he did is he went to where the battle was supposed to happen. And the way the tale is told, the two sides were lined up, and he just walked in the middle and sat down. And they just, no one could do anything because it was the Buddha, and he was a really well-known spiritual teacher. And so he kind of diffused that situation. And then he brought the kings of both sides together and said, hey, fellas, what the hell, and they start to have a talk here. And it cooled it out for a while. And then he got the memo again. Hey, there's war between Sylvania and Perrysburg again. Can you come out? Okay. He did it again. Kind of the same thing happened. The third time, he went there, and he was there with his attendant, Ananda, and some other disciples, and he said there's just nothing that can be done. So that time, he went and sat above it on a hill and watched them slaughter each other. And then he did what he could with intentions for the deaths that were going on, but there was nothing he could do. And I really like that story because I know what it is to feel helpless like that. I too sit there and marvel at the idiocy with which the vehemence of these arguments plays out. And I'm staggered by it. I can't believe. And yet there it is. And what the Buddha said is that, there are those for whom the veil is thin, that the coverings to their awakening are very, very slight, and I can be of some use to them. But for those that are enmeshed and admired, there's nothing I can do. I cannot zap them with awakening. Now, what he did do, however, there were other folks that he taught that were the political leaders. That's a different situation. When he was talking to political leaders, and this, by the way, I'm referring to the Buddha a lot, but any awakened master is also a Buddha. So there have been many, many, many examples of this down to our current day of awakened humans, right? And they tend to counsel rulers that when you're in charge of a political thing, an emperor, a king, a politician of some kind. There are skillful and less skillful ways of persuading. And the more clarity that the individual has, the more persuasive they can potentially be and should try to be. But the fact is, it's far easier to like destroy things than it is to build them up. You know, like how much, my daughter is 25 almost, and we've put at least 25 years of constant care and love. And a simple misstep, a simple, innocent, maybe well-intended a truck driver falling asleep at the wrong moment, and so easy to destroy. Making this building was an immense effort. I mean, so many people for so many years putting so much attention and intent into creating this space, it could be burned down so quick, right? It's always easier to destroy. So what I notice is that, you know, amongst the folks that I have influence with, which is a very small number of people, but among those people, I really bring the A game that I can. And people that are further from that sphere of influence, depending on their mind states and how I may or may not be able to interface with them, I'll go there. But there are certain people I know right now, I'm just gonna be, there's nothing I can do. And so I have to watch my heart. You know, when the Buddha sat there and watched them slay each other, this was not a joyful picnic. Especially if you realize yourself as all those other people too. And it's like waves killing waves. And we're all the ocean, and this is just ridiculous, you know? But there's a very practical reality of at a certain point, there's only so much that a person can do, you know? I wish there was a better answer, but, you know, I think the idea that the Buddha has a plan for us all. And the Buddha works in mysterious ways. It just doesn't help me. I don't find any consolation in those kind of stories. If some people do, blessings on them. I don't. It just pisses me off. I don't like that way of thinking about it. I find it very insulting and very demeaning. You know, I just don't, not only do I not believe it, I find it takes our agency away. The fact is, no one is coming to save us. We're on our own. We need to really do this. And that is scary, and it's messy, and it's complicated, but to my best lights, that's what's true. And so with that in mind, I'm gonna link hands with everybody that I can and try to do as wise and compassionate a maneuver as I can possibly muster, no matter what else happens. And I'm doing it. That's as much as I can do. Does it make sense? Yeah. And then practically, one thing that I know is very, very powerful, and it's actually really easy to do in this environment when people are so polarized, they really expect spectacle. And they expect when they see that you're not wearing the same color hat that they are, that you're gonna make them look like an idiot. And so they're gonna make you look like an idiot. And so when I don't do that, it's very disarming. When I actually find the common ground that there's way more of than the narrations would tell you. And I just focus on that. That is already eroding one of the main points, which is that there's an enemy within and they're vermin. We're gonna root them all out. They're not even people. Like, no, actually they love their kids too. In fact, we're both fond of barbecue, it turns out. How about that? And we like the mud hens, you know, and suddenly it's a more realistic conversation. So I do find practically that's something I can do. Yeah. Others?
Earlier, when you were saying there's a point where we establish some level of stability and depth, and those things that would pull us around, they're just no longer interesting.
Yeah.
In your experience, when that kind of unfolds, what sorts of things traditionally emerge as interesting?
Oh, well, I mean, the first thing is that, you know, it is the case that as people, you go back to the wave metaphor, the more the wave doesn't just glimpse that there's water under there and wonder what that was, but actually get good at deep diving, the wave is increasingly comfortable with what's going on. And so all the froth up there legitimately doesn't bother it. It's still frothing. I mean, the wave still has a crest and the water and all that. So life is still tumbling around. But it really doesn't have this, that's not everything that's happening. This little froth is like my fingernail width on top of the ocean. It's just not the main story, right? So then what becomes more interesting, I would say, is what does it mean to play freely in self-fulfilling and other-fulfilling samadhi? What would I like to experience and express? What would compassion do? And it's delicious and it's delightful and it's amazing. There's all kinds of, and it can be just sit out there, look out the window with those amazing leaves. That's a nice way to spend some time. But it's not because if I do the leaves, then I'll get a reward that then makes me better and I can lord that over someone else who didn't do the leaf and I did. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So, I mean, I think the quick answer that occurs is love becomes very interesting and fear becomes just like kind of silly.
We did this same sort of thing 4 years ago, and it was after the election.
Yeah.
This one is before the election, and there was less people at this one than the other one that was after the election. What do you think of that? You think it's, you know, before the event, like, are we trembling before this election? It's like, oh my God.
You know, I don't know. It could be a bunch of things, but depending how the election goes, we might do another one and that might fill up. I mean, you know, yeah, I mean, yeah, that was pretty scary when Trump got elected the first time. I mean, a lot of people were in just utter disbelief that this could happen. And that provided a lot of wind to the sails to people being interested in other perspectives. So it may be the case that, you know, I can't believe it, but a lot of young people that I know at the university, they're not going to vote and they feel like it doesn't matter. And I engage with them on that subject. But I think for those kids, if they don't vote and things go in a way that they don't like, they might have some more motivation. So I don't know. I mean, that could be a part of it. I think back then we did, what was it? Mindful activism was the title of the thing, and it was around how to be active in society without just burning out and turning into a hate-filled cinder of unrequited longing. So yeah, there's that. Speaking of that, Stuart, yes.
Other thoughts, questions?
Okay, so let me conclude then by just saying that clearly Buddhism is not the only path. There's many paths, but also it's clear that some paths are more helpful than others. The path of pure hedonistic pleasure seeking is not so good. The path of leaving the world, its evil, and going off and being an ascetic somewhere, I think is not so good. I think what the world actually is most benefited by is people who are deeply engaged in the world and deeply engaged in lives that are fully in full contact with the churn, but folks that know how to hit the pause button and how to return to the source and bring that contemplative source and that deep intelligence and wisdom into the day, into the conversations. In a very real way, conversation is the last defense against violence. If you can't, when we get to the point where conversation no longer works, we devolve into force, right? So learning how to have difficult conversations is a very important and relevant skill today. My goal is not to convert anyone or convince them of something else, but my goal is to have a humanizing and connecting conversation with as many people as possible, because that humanizing and connecting conversation is the basis around which society can function. If I relegate people to a cartoon image of themselves and write them all off, then I'm on the same footing as everyone else who holds up a fictional standard and says, these are not true people, we can slay them all. In fact, God's happy if we do. Let's march, shall we? Rather than that, a good belly-to-belly conversation. So I'd encourage all of us, as perhaps a practice, I'll get opportunity, perhaps you will, try to have a meaningful conversation and connection with somebody you don't agree with. And really have as your goal, not to convince anyone or convert anybody, but simply to affirm the common humanity and have a good conversation together. And just because you can see a way to like intellectually slam them down doesn't mean you should do it. You have to be very careful if you're going to actually help people. Does it make sense? So may the merit of our work this afternoon go to all those who are deeply stuck in falsehoods that cause them suffering, those that have themselves so identified with a set of ideas and concepts that they're willing to burn everything down in the name of it. May they all find space, may they find love, and may they find light. May they realize themselves as the ocean, as the sky, as the great earth itself. And may all beings be free from suffering throughout space and time. May it be so. Thank you very much, everybody. I'd like to say for the benefit of the visitors that we offer beginning instruction in how to do Zen meditation here every Sunday at 10 and every Wednesday at 7:30. You're most welcome to come back and check that out. It would give you the basic technique that we use here as a meditational approach. And thank you all for being here and supporting this. Thank you, everybody.
Just a quick request to any members who can stick around and help us restore the Zendo. That would be much appreciated. Thank you.